Good. Well, welcome everybody. I'm sure that many more people will be joining us as we go. My name's Bernard Prusak, and I'm the director of the McGowan Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility at King's College in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, which is in the northeast corner, more or less, of the state. This is our 10th and final fall 2020 Zoom event, and it seems like a fitting culmination too. Here we are on November 5th. So I titled this event a post-election forum. It's more or less that. I mean, it is a post-election forum in some regards. It's also, though, I think, a post-election day forum. Our main questions are what just happened and what does it mean? Dr. Beth Admiraal keeps pressing me to say I've got to ask instead what is happening, what might happen, what might it mean, so on and so forth. So we've got a lot of variations on those questions to consider during our time. As you can see, we have 5 panelists. Let me do brief bios, and then we'll talk about nuts and bolts and how we're going to proceed. So Dr. Beth Admiraal, she can wave. There she is professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at King's College. She is co-editor of the journal Occasional Papers on Religion in Eastern Europe and has published numerous articles on religion and nationalism in the post-Soviet region. And thank you, Beth, for doing this today. Milton Javier Bravo recently completed his doctorate from Fordham University with a dissertation on U.S. Hispanic popular Catholicism. He has more than 12 years of higher education administration experience with professional expertise in student affairs, student services, mission integration, research, and teaching, which to me means he's a very busy man. In his current role with Commonweal magazine as Director of Audience Development, he's focused on current and emerging demographics in American society and the U.S. Catholic Church. Ting Cho Lau, got a wave, Ting, there he is the Moreau Postdoctoral Fellow in the McGowan Center at King's College. So he's a colleague of mine and of Beth. He's a recent graduate of the University of Notre Dame with a PhD in philosophy. He works in ethics with interests in applied and political philosophy. Mollie Wilson O'Reilly is, like Joe Biden, a native of the much celebrated Scranton, Pennsylvania, which is about 20 miles up the road from Wilkes-Barre. She's Commonweal's editor at large, and she's also a friend to the McGowan Center. She presented the center's Feast of St. Francis lecture in 2014. And last but not least is Jon Shields, who is Associate Professor of Government at Claremont McKenna College in California. His most recent book is Trump's Democrats, co-authored with Stephanie Moravchik. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and elsewhere. Thanks to all of you for joining us. I'm really looking forward to this conversation today. We've got an hour plus or so. So I got just some nuts and bolts before I can be quiet. The event is being recorded. Recording will be posted sometime soon on the McGowan Center's YouTube channel and in a few days on the McGowan Center's Facebook page. So if you want to watch this again or send it to somebody, please look at those places. If you happen to be able to unmute yourself, which shouldn't be the case unless you're a presenter, please don't unmute yourself. If you happen to be able to turn on your video, please don't do that either. For purposes of our Q&A, so please send your questions through the chat. And if you're new to Zoom, the little chat button is at the bottom of your page. You click that and then the chat pops up. So send your questions to me. I'm at least one of the hosts, Bernard Prusak. Normally, I play the role of moderator. I'm going to do that to some extent still. And I will pose the questions to the speakers, but I'm taking a really big chance this time. It's a radical departure. I'm going to unmute people after you send me your questions. This is a little bit like talk radio. I'll see your question, and then I'll unmute you, and you can enter the conversation with all the panelists. So that's how we're planning to do it. Okay, so each panelist is going to talk for 2 to 3 minutes or so. We're going in alphabetical order about our questions. So what just happened, what's happening, what might happen, and what does it mean? And after each panelist has spoken for a little bit, then there'll be a discussion among the panelists. And at that point, we'll open the floor to questions. So thanks everybody for joining us. And thanks again to our panelists. So take it away, Beth Admiraal.
All right, thank you, Bernard. And thank you everybody for coming. This is an exciting time. Usually Russian politics are more exciting than American politics, but this might be an exception. So glad to be here. So having teased Bernard about the title, I actually would like to speak for my 2 minutes about something that did happen and that we know happened, and that is that the polls got it wrong again. So they underestimated Trump's support in 2016, and despite having claimed that they figured out and resolved the issues, they definitely underestimated his support again this time. For example, they projected a narrow loss for Trump in Ohio, Iowa, Florida, but as we know, of course, he was declared the winner by a pretty considerable margin, and we know that already. So, one question you might have is it possible that, there are more Democratic voters that just couldn't vote? They were prevented from voting. Their votes were rejected. Votes didn't arrive in time in the mail. Maybe they're still sitting somewhere in some mailbox. I think that's somewhat unlikely. In fact, the preliminary exit polls seem to back up the argument that the polls just simply got it wrong again. And of course, this raises questions that were asked in 2016. Do Trump supporters feel more social pressure to say they're voting for Biden? And that's in fact what some of the exit polls seem to suggest. Exit polls show that both college-educated and non-college educated male voters voted for Trump in higher margins than the polls suggested they would. Some of you may have heard of the name Kahale. He's a Republican pollster with a somewhat shadowy Trafalgar group. He was really the only pollster who got it right in 2016, and this time around, predictably, he was still claiming as of election morning that we were going to see a Trump victory, which of course is less likely at this point, but not out of the question. And at minimum, what we know is that he called Ohio and Iowa correctly. In an interview not long ago, he says, quote, "If you're the kind of person who's quiet and non-confrontational, you aren't going to say anything, and a lot of those people live in the Midwest." Well, I'm a Midwesterner, and I think I know what he's talking about. I think that may have been the case. But the polls got other things wrong too, besides the vote count. So I think we do need to start thinking about and considering other ways in which other things besides the shy voter. For example, the virus was much less of a motivating factor for voters than pollsters were led to think early on. So I think at this point, going forward, we need to question pollsters more carefully. We need to ask questions about the assumptions they're putting into their results, and I think maybe an entirely new approach before the election. So anyway, so that's what we know actually happened. So I've stuck with your title, Bernard, and I'll turn it over now to, I guess, to Milton, right, in the alphabet.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you all for hosting this conversation. To go along the lines of affirming what just happened, perhaps one of the things that we can say regarding the this quote-unquote Latino bloc, Latino vote, the Latino voters, once again, there seems to be an indication that Trump has gained about 25 to 29% of the Latino vote, depending where you are, which state you're looking at. And again, the majority of the Latino vote has gone to Biden. And as we all know, the notion of the Latino vote is very much misleading because depending where you are in the country, you have to make the distinction between different communities, such as the Cuban American community, the Puerto Rican community, other communities from the Caribbean, Central America, Mexico, Mexican Americans, as well as communities that have Hispanic origin in Latin America and South America. And recently in Commonweal magazine, we published a book review by Brandon Sanchez. And the book is entitled The Hispanic Republican, The Shaping of an American Political Identity from Nixon to Trump by Geraldo Cadaba. In this book makes that exact same sort of claim, that there is always sort of this consistent 1/3 Latino quote unquote vote to a Republican candidate in the presidential election, and that has been a decline for a couple of different presidential elections, but more or less you're looking at about 25 to 29%. And so looking at that, so that's sort of the journalist perspective. I'm also a practical theologian, I guess, and looking at this reality, I also have to ask the question, well, what comes next, right? In looking at our own communities and looking at our social teaching in the Catholic Church, such as the principle of solidarity, I do wonder how much we still need to engage within our own communities to understand the complexities of the issues we're really concerned about, as well as get a real sense of interconnectedness and interdependence. Obviously, you're not only looking at the differences between communities within the Latino vote, but you're also looking at gender differences and generational differences in men and women and older voters versus younger voters. So as I'm looking ahead, what is to come next? And we may have breaking news as we have this conversation, which is really exciting. I just wonder, what will be the role of people of goodwill, the role of theologians, the role of people of faith, as we continue to see this nation that is divided. 72 million votes for Biden, 68 million votes for Trump. That has also been affirmed. The division in this country is still very much present. And so looking ahead, what comes next, what will be our role? I think that's something I would like to sort of explore a little bit further. And again, thank you so much for having me in this conversation.
All right, am I up next? Okay, so I'll say a little bit about what has happened, what is happening, and what will happen, maybe. So what has happened, there's actually a number of ballot initiatives that are kind of curiously interesting that might have not have been, or have been overlooked in the past few days, given the presidential election. So for example, in Oregon, possession of small quantities of any drug, hard drugs, is now decriminalized. You can also do hallucinogenic mushrooms now in DC and Oregon. A third of the states now have some form of legalized marijuana. So that's very interesting if you are against the criminalization of drugs. That seems to be kind of like a trend that's going on in a number of states. And California politics has become kind of interesting. There's kind of this divide between folks in Silicon Valley and folks who are working more wage jobs. California has rejected a measure to extend employer status to gig workers, like folks who work in Lyft and Uber and stuff like that. But at the same time, California has also rejected a reinstatement of affirmative action in public higher education. And other things too, odds and ends, Massachusetts has rejected ranked voting. So these are just kind of some interesting trends that are going on or bylines that we maybe haven't, had on our minds recently. So what's happening right now? Let's see. So the presidential race, has not been called. It's extremely close, but we're getting some results from Nevada suggesting that Biden's going to maintain the lead there. The rest of the counties, with the ballots coming in, tend to lean left. Georgia is extremely interesting right now. Who would have thought that Georgia might turn blue? But we're down to the last 40,000 or so ballots, and it seems that there might be a possibility that Biden could, eke it out. And what's really interesting there too is that Jon Ossoff's opponent now has less than 50% of the votes for the Senate. So that might turn into a runoff too. So there might be two runoff elections for senator in Georgia. So we won't find out about the rest of Maricopa County in Arizona until later tonight, about 9 p.m. And we're still getting ballots in Philadelphia and the rest of Pennsylvania, but it's looking good for Biden at this point there as well. So finally, the Senate. So Democrats did not have a good night when it came to the Senate. So there were projections that they might win 51 or 52 seats. That has not happened. Right now, it's likely that they're going to have 48 by the end of this week. But They might still be able to gain control of the Senate if they win both of the runoff elections in Georgia, assuming that we do have the runoff elections there on January 5th. And if that's the case, then Kamala Harris becomes a deciding vote. So very interesting things coming up for whether Biden's going to be able to push his legislative agenda, depending on whether the Senate gets control, or the Democrats get control of the Senate.
Okay, great. It's great to be here. So Stefan Rochek and I have spent the last 4 years trying to make sense of the 2016 election, and not entirely. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not next. Right, I jumped the queue. Sorry.
That's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, there you go. I was going to tell Mollie you're W after all.
My bad. I'm sorry, Mollie. So we've spent the last 4 years trying to make sense of the 2016 election, and so it's a little daunting to now switch gears and try to make sense of an election that happened just a few days ago and still really hasn't been decided. We got interested in the 2016 election because one third of the counties that voted for Obama flipped and voted for Donald Trump in 2016, and some of these places, are bellwethers, so it's not so surprising that they flipped in 2016, but many are not. Many are really had been faithful and loyal to the Democratic Party for decades until they flipped for Trump in 2016. Some had flipped in 1972 when they voted for Nixon. Others had flipped in '84 when they voted for Reagan. And, of course, we're accustomed to thinking about the Nixon Democrats and the Reagan Democrats. But the Trump Democrats are far more interesting. And they're more interesting because 1972 and 1984 were landslides. And so it's not so surprising that in a landslide elections, you get some places that are blue that flip to red. But 2016, as we know, was not a landslide, right? In fact, Clinton, the Democrat, won the popular vote. And yet, despite that fact, Trump managed to win some of the most loyal blue communities in the country, places where all the local politicians are Democrats, places where the party really has a lot of power and deep roots. And so in 2020, we were curious, what happened to all of these Obama-Trump counties? And perhaps not surprisingly, given the overall results, the vast majority of them stayed loyal to Donald Trump. There were a few exceptions here and there. There were a few places in Minnesota that Biden flipped back. There was one place in Michigan, but throughout the upper Midwest, these places stayed with Trump. And I think, so I guess I'll just say a couple quick things about what this might mean. I think for Democrats, even if Biden ekes out a narrow victory, I suspect he will, I think it shows that, I think this election highlights that these places are going to be important and consequential in the future. And so if Democrats really want to rebuild this blue wall, which Biden really made a priority these last few months, if they want to do that, it's going to be hard to do it without flipping more of these places back, right? They're going to need to get these voters and counties are really concentrated in the upper Midwest. The white working class is in decline, but they're really overrepresented in these states. And so, Democrats, I think, have to take this problem seriously. I think Republicans, and this is the last thing I'll say, I think face a different challenge. If Biden wins, I think they have to. I think they have to somehow dispense with Trumpism, right, to return their party to sanity. On the one hand, but on the other hand, they also have to, appeal to all these new Trumpian enthusiasts, right? All these new Trump Democrats that have come flooding into their party in the last couple elections. And so they have to walk a kind of political and cultural tightrope as they do both of those things. So thanks, and sorry again to Mollie.
Hi, no problem. That was actually kind of a helpful segue into what I want to say, talking about, well, what about the Republicans now? What comes next? Because when I look at the question of what's happening now, what's happening right now, the first answer that comes to mind for me is the Republicans are trying to steal the election. It doesn't seem to be working, as Ting was saying, you know, given the count is going on, it's happening, the lawsuits that the Trump campaign is filing in attempt to stop the count in various states are being rejected as without merit, which they are. And although I don't watch cable news pretty much ever, my sense from what I'm seeing people say about it, like on Twitter, is that the networks, with the exception of Fox, are carrying on, covering the actual count, you know, the way that they would. And that's encouraging. I have a sense from that Trump is sort of being treated as the lame duck that he now appears to be. And the fever is breaking a little. And so the fact that he is continuing to insist that he actually won this election is being sort of politely ignored in serious conversations like this one. But it doesn't change the fact that it is happening, that the Republican Party, or at least the Trump campaign, is committing itself to attempting to make this election a win regardless of what the vote count says. And that's been going on since the campaign began. The Trump and his appointees tried to sabotage the post office. They sowed misinformation throughout the campaign about absentee ballots and mail-in voting and the potential for corruption and legitimacy. They complained of non-existent fraud throughout. Trump floated the idea of maybe postponing the election at one point. He threatened in-person voter intimidation, either via federal law enforcement or also just freelance right-wing squads. And that's on top of all of the regular voter suppression, closing ballot drop-off options and that sort of thing. So now, with them attempting to use the judicial system to invalidate the votes even as they're being counted, it's an undeniable fact that this is the path that the Republican Party has committed itself to. And all of that will still be true if Joe Biden gets to 270, as I expect him to. The Republican Party has long been committed to minority rule, accepting that it almost never wins the popular vote. But up to now, it had the Electoral College. Now, if it loses the Electoral College and continues to insist that actually we were supposed to win, it's an outright embrace of maintaining power via illegitimate means. And that includes the spread of misinformation via the right-wing media and also via the presidency itself. And that seems to me like a very serious problem for the country. And while I am looking forward to an end to President Trump in the White House and seeing hopeful signs that that fever is breaking, it will remain a problem under President Biden, especially because he campaigned on the idea of restoring bipartisanship and reaching across the aisle and expecting the Republican Party to find its better angels again once Trump was out of the picture. It also strikes me as a big problem for the Catholic Church in this country, insofar as it is allied with the GOP. I don't think we can ignore that dynamic. I think it's badly discrediting for the church to associate itself with outright misinformation campaigns or the subversion of democracy and the abandonment of solidarity. So those are the dynamics that seem really important to me, regardless of where the vote totals end up. And even if Joe Biden gets a clean victory and nobody pays any more attention to Donald Trump shouting about how actually he won.
Thank you very much, all of you. So I'd ask you to talk among yourselves. So do you have any questions for one another or points that you might want to make given what someone else said, so on and so forth. So if you want to unmute yourselves, go for it. But this time is for you to engage with one another.
Yeah, I'm in much agreement with a lot of Mollie's points. I do kind of wonder whether some of the Republican, elite might actually be now starting to distance themselves from Trump. So, for example, we saw Mitch McConnell, responding to some of the stuff that's going on with Trump's statements, and he says, "No, what we have to do is we have to wait and make sure that all of the votes are counted." And Mitch McConnell's extremely shrewd, right? So if he sees that, he's on a boat that's sinking, and he wants to maintain the Republican Party, he might just ditch Trump. I'm not quite so sure whether all of the Republicans will now go along with Trump if they recognize that it's a sinking ship. But I get the point. And also with Fox News, actually, a number of Fox News anchors, have surprisingly tried to push back against some of Trump's statements. Take it for what you will. Chris Wallace, for example, said, no, what we have to do is we have to count all the votes. Not that I'm necessarily defending Fox News or Mitch McConnell, but I am pointing out that there is beginning to be a slight kind of a movement away from Trump at this point.
Ting, well, I agree with you that there's this distancing happening. Trump, even if he does lose, as Mollie predicts, won't be gone. He has, at minimum 70-something days, right, in office, which he can do a lot. He has, I don't know if we're talking 68 million plus votes right now, more than he got last time. So there is some sort of mandate in that. He may very well start his own broadcasting network, and that may put him in the public space for years to come. He has apparently talked quietly about running again if he loses this time, although you do wonder, if his age would actually prevent him from seriously making some serious effort. And I think overall, I think he has such a strong base of support that I don't think, I don't think senators, I don't think Congress can afford to distance themselves. The Republican Party can afford to distance themselves too much. Otherwise, I think they really risk losing that base of support in upcoming elections.
Fair point. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I had hoped I had hoped that Biden would win in a landslide, partly because, I think the margins here might matter, right? I mean, if Biden had won in a landslide, I think that would have done a lot to marginalize Trumpism. If you think about the Republican Party and its different elements, there were the intellectuals, of course, the neoconservatives, et cetera, in DC, who were stalwart in rejecting Trump. But a lot of the operatives, initially they didn't like him, but warmed up to him because he showed that he could win, right? And he showed that he could win places that Republicans have struggled to have success in a long time. And so I had really hoped that Trump would get creamed, and then Republican operatives and others would take a different lesson from this election and decide that they needed to chart a new path and make amends with the never Trumpers and sort of reconstitute the party. But because it's going to be razor close, I think that's I have less hope that the party will purge its new sort of Trumpian sort of orientation. I think the other thing, one quick thing I'd say too is, I think in some ways though, I think our Trump is both an accelerant. He's both he's both the cause of a lot of, I think, bad things, but he's also a kind of symptom of broader problems. And I think even if he does go away into the darkness and doesn't, as Ting suggested, start his own, show and he kind of disappears, I think we'll have to reckon with a lot of problems that Trump is partly a symptom of. And one of them, I think Mollie's pointing to in a kind of way, which is a kind of legitimation problem, a kind of loss of faith in sort of legitimacy of institutions. I think it's worse now on the right, but I think you see it certainly on the left. I think that just to give a quick example, I think the desire to defund police, right? Which obviously there's a lot of legitimate sort of concerns and grievances there that I'm sympathetic to, but it's also it really sort of fits our more general, I think, cultural sensibility, which is that, our institutions are sort of irredeemable and need to be burnt to the ground, you know, and I sort of see this on the right too, with respect to the university, right? There's a sense the university has become corrupt to the core and is irredeemable. And so I think one of the tasks really sort of beyond Trump is restoring, you know, faith in our institutions. And I think this is, again, a problem across the political spectrum.
One thing that is occurring to me is that none of us mentioned anything about the coronavirus pandemic, even though it's shaped, you know, the very shape of this event and everything else in our lives is so affected by it. And that strikes me as also something to worry about, since the Republican Party didn't get that sort of major humiliation that it might have gotten that would force it to reassess its approach. You know, we still have between now and January with Trump in charge, and it looks to be a very crucial period when, again, we could do something to get this virus under control and probably won't. Probably that's not going to happen. And I worry about what seems to have happened in this election is that Trump benefited from politicizing the pandemic in a way that I wouldn't have thought possible, but managed to, instead of making his best effort to contain it, he did not do that, and then complained about how everybody was trying to use this thing that China did to make him look bad, and it seems to have worked. And so I worry that the Republican Party, or at least the right-wing media, will continue along that path and find the sort of spreading of misinformation about what's happening and resisting attempts to take serious steps to finally get it under control is politically more advantageous than working with a Biden presidency to do the sorts of things that the Trump presidency could have done in March and April. So that's not very cheerful, but it just occurs to me that that's another outcome.
Yeah, I mean, I just quickly on COVID, it's an interesting point. I mean, I do wonder, I mean, on the other hand, I sometimes wonder if Trump really would have won this in a walk if not for COVID, you know. And if that's right, it may be that, you know, only a global pandemic followed by economic and ruin and social despair was enough to drive Trump from office. You know, I mean, I mean, I don't know. Does anyone doubt that? I mean, it's a tough counterfactual, but given how badly he's handled the crisis, you know, it's quite striking to me that he's going to lose apparently by the slimmest of margins.
And maybe if I could just add to your point, John, regarding the social ills and Trump being a symptom. You know, when we're looking at older Latino men, particularly in communities such as in Florida that voted again for Trump, the messaging of this machismo again was well received by that, you know, that block of the Latino voters. And we're looking at Arizona and looking at Nevada, and that is a different type of Latino community there, and it's predominantly Mexican or Mexican American, Mexican descent, and they're voting for Biden. You know, that's the story there. That's the story in the Southwest. And so to just affirm what you're saying is what will come next. I mean, the division is very much present, and things that people have experienced, such as racism, such as misogyny, such as, you know, police violence and police brutality. Those issues, as well as the things that we're also concerned with regarding healthcare and access to healthcare, access to education, economic upward mobility, all of these different issues are certainly not going to go away. And so the question that I posed earlier still sort of stands. What is our role? You know, those of us that have the privilege to speak in forums such as these, but as well as have a voice. How do we bring people together? How do we work towards learning to listen, learning to engage, so we can learn to lead together? obviously is very utopian and ideal of me, but I don't know about you all, but I can't take 4 years of the division again, and it's coming because, as we all have mentioned, the media will continue to feed off of this polarization in the country and polarization in our communities, and so we need to be aware of that and attentive to that. So, just to affirm what you said before, Jon.
Thanks, Milton. I guess I have a quick thing. And I mean, I'm glad you brought up machismo. I mean, it's something I've been thinking about the last few days, because one of the things Stephanie and I found in our fieldwork is that in a lot of the white working class communities we studied, there's a very strong honor culture. And so for those listening who aren't familiar with the term, it's a term that comes out of sociology. And if you're in an honor culture, it's very important for men in particular, but also for women, to defend one's social reputation for toughness, right? So you should never let an insult slide. Never let anything roll off your back. You can't take Michelle Obama's advice if you're in this world, right? When they go low, you go high, right? One must always be tough, and of course in honor culture, it tends to be found. They're common throughout the world, common throughout the United States. We see them not just in white working class communities, but lots of Black and Latino communities. So I think one thing that's been underappreciated in some ways is that there's a different kind of identity politics that's going on too, right? It's not just a racial identity politics, but a kind of class-based one and cultural one. And this gets to the issue of the church a little bit, because, in a lot of the communities we studied, this honor culture does butt against the church. The church in the communities we studied tends to soften men and teaches them to, not always punch back, but to turn the other cheek. And I'll share a quick anecdote here. I went to this was in a Rust Belt town in Iowa, and we went to a church, a large mega church there, and it was about marriage. And the pastor said something like, it's okay to apologize to your wife, right? It's not a sign of weakness to do that, right? You can be a real man and apologize. But because of secularization, I think there's less. In a lot of these places, there's sort of less cultural pushback against the kind of machismo that Milton's describing.
Yeah.
Ting, please, and then we should probably turn to questions soon, but go on.
Yeah, so now this gets me to think about Democratic strategy in the long run, because people are saying, oh, we're going to ride a demographic wave, and there's going to be, and that's going to help with the blue wave later on too, making certain kinds of states competitive. But I think that is overly optimistic, and the ground game that the Biden campaign had in Florida was awful. They just didn't pay attention to it because they thought, the polls show that they were up, right? So they wanted to focus on the Rust Belt states, particularly Pennsylvania. But there was a misinformation campaign in the Latino community in Miami-Dade County, and when you find out that it was only won by 9%, you pretty much lost Florida, right? With that, I want to make sure that, we're just not thinking about, oh, here's the Latino community, because it's multifaceted, right? And there's a variety of different political opinions, amongst the Latino community. So there's maybe more right-leaning Cuban Americans, right? Maybe folks who are coming from Venezuela who are extremely wary of socialist regimes, right? But then you might find folks in Texas, right, who are coming from Mexico as immigrants, right, who are extremely against Trump's immigration policies. It's going to have these differences there, right? So, I'm just thinking that, the Democrats were just not as sensitive to these kinds of differences as they needed to be, right? And they have to be more careful about that going forward. And look, there's even more of a rural-urban divide now, as shown by some of the recent results here. So they have to really think about what that's going to be like and how they're going to be able to speak to the people that Joe has been trying to speak to in this campaign. It seems like it hasn't worked. So yeah, just thinking about some things that the Democrats are going to be able to need to do going forward. And unfortunately, they didn't do that this time around.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's a great discussion. So let's hear from some other voices. Mary Wood, I'm going to unmute you and ask you to pose your question about Arizona, if you would. So here you go. I asked you to unmute yourself, Mary. I hope you can do it.
I did. Yes, thank you. I just was wondering if you could maybe explain why, as you said, Latinos are voting for Biden, mostly, but Latinos in Florida, specifically in the Miami-Dade, are voting for Trump. Is that, do you see that as cultural or just different location, geographics? I'm just wondering your thoughts.
Yeah, and I just thank you for that, Mary, and to just affirm what Ting said. This whole notion of the anti-communism and the anti-socialism sort of messaging that did take place not only in this election but obviously in 2016. Just obviously capture the sort of the imagination of some communities, and so that is one misinformation campaign that worked. And so Trump and the Trump campaign did what they needed to do. It wasn't so much as to gain Latino votes. That's not the narrative that occurred, but it was more so to neutralize communities and Latino votes, specifically in areas such as Florida and such as Miami-Dade County. As far as what's happening in Arizona, and we'll learn more as the days go by and as the weeks go by. Clearly, the groundwork of organizers, of Latino community organizing that occurred there did have consequences. Did provide votes for Biden, and I think we'll learn more about those communities. But it also didn't happen overnight, and as we were just mentioning before. There are Mexican Americans, 6th, 7th, 8th generation, living in this area, and we always go back to that phrase that for many Mexican Americans, for many communities in the Southwest, the border they didn't cross the border crossed them in the late 1800s, and so they've always been there, they've always been present, and this is the first, I believe, and we have a room of political scientists, so please correct me if I'm wrong. But one of the first elections where you have a Latino vote in all 50 states, which is also something to be, to take into account.
David Kalinowski, and I apologize if I have mispronounced your last name. Would you please ask your question about the Senate and polling? So I'm going to unmute you now, and I hope that works.
Yes, thank you, and terrific panel and discussion here. So my question, and I know Ting had mentioned this early on, but why did the Democratic leadership or pollsters get it wrong in terms of flipping the Senate and picking up even additional House seats? Do you think it was Trump coattails, or was it something else?
Beth, do you want to speak to that initially, maybe?
Well, maybe not Trump coattails, but a lack of Biden coattails is the better way to frame it, right? The expectation was that Biden would pull in, I think, more senators and representatives than he did, or seems to have. I think that the polls were wrong on so many issues. They were wrong on what mattered to people when they went to vote. They were wrong on the results, both at the presidential level and other levels as well. And I do think it must reflect, and again, these are all early assumptions because we really don't know and won't know for some time what went wrong, but it must reflect, at least in part, a failure to sort of recognize that conservatives, and maybe I should say more Trumpists, respond differently to pollsters than maybe conservatives, other conservatives, and certainly Democrats. And so even efforts to account for that didn't seem to work. And so they again, the exit polls suggested both for presidential but also senatorial candidates that among both college-educated and non-college educated male voters, there was a high percentage of them who, it seems, did not answer honestly in the polls. I guess there's also maybe a possibility that the sampling was wrong. There's some thought that conservatives are less likely to answer the phone now. Callaghy, who I mentioned earlier, the pollster who seems to have gotten it right, maybe for the second time almost, he'll say that you can't just rely on that kind of phone sampling anymore. It simply is going to end up biased with biased results. Now, Ting, you want to add anything, or somebody else?
Yeah.
I want to hear from Jon too. No, good, Ting, you speak. I want to ask Jon a question about Trump's Democrats in that regard, but Ting, go on, please.
I don't want to put myself in the unadmirable position of trying to defend the polls, but let me put on the Nate Silver hat for a bit. I guess so for example, the Cal Cunningham seat, right? He was up, and it seemed like he probably would have won, but and I don't know exactly how much this affected it, but there's a sexting thing, right? And it's like you can't really predict that kind of stuff. But that's one seat, right? So the polling projections were something like they might get 51.7 seats, right? So let's just say 51 seats. So what ended up happening is if Cal Cunningham would have gotten that seat, we would have been at 49 Senate seats. So we still would have been about 2 off. So then, you might think, well, what was going on is that Susan Collins ended up being a lot stronger, right, than we might have originally thought. And Joni Ernst too, right? So those 2 seats, once they went, for the Democrat or for the Republicans, game over, right? To some extent, yes, I recognize, definitely, I think the polls, were not maybe capturing the issues that voters were concerned about. But part of me is like, let's not bash the polls too much. These political scientists aren't completely silly, right? And of course, Beth, you're one of them. But just talk about the quant guys, I guess, and gals. But yeah.
Go ahead, Bert. If you want to ask a question.
I was just going to ask you to speak, in fact. So please.
Well, I just quickly, on polling. Social scientists are generally terrible about predicting the future. The one exception was polling, and we could actually predict elections, and now we can't even do that apparently. So, but maybe, maybe Ting's right too. We should have a more charitable and realistic assessment of polls, that there are all kinds of sources of error. Beth is pointing to one, which is that, it's not just social desirability bias that might play a role, but also response bias. And there are all kinds of sources of error of polling. And maybe what we should be more impressed by is actually just, maybe what's weird is the expectation that that polls are going to be perfect, right? And we should just expect polling to perfectly predict election results, and that's just unreasonable. I'm not a pollster. I don't quite. On the other hand, I guess I'll contradict myself now. Maybe Trafalgar has figured this out, right? And there'll be some new sort of paradigm shift, a new kind of method if he ever shares what he's doing, I guess, with how and we'll get better at sussing these things out before the election day.
Can I add one thing a second, Bernard? And that is that they were right in 2018, right? The polls. So, which is interesting, right? Maybe the wild card here is maybe Trump on the ballot. Consider.
Yeah, some people have said that Trump is the Republican Barack Obama. So there you go.
So Julia Sweeney, would you ask your question about Trump's litigation?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, just making sure. So I just, I was wondering, obviously there's going to be legal issues with the results of the election. And I was just wondering, when that happens, could it delay Biden's inauguration, or will someone else qualified take oath of office for the time being, like while it gets sorted out?
How about a political science or no? Good, Molly, you're up. You
I
unmuted.
was just going to say, I don't know if any of us know the ins and outs of the Constitution or well enough to answer that question. I'm not sure that we need to worry about a legitimate legal challenge at this point, but it's the illegitimate legal challenges that I'm more concerned about. We know Mitch McConnell, for example, is not constrained by the things that he has said in the past he thinks the Constitution requires, if saying something different would be advantageous to him. And we know that Trump put Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court, explicitly saying that he was doing it because he expected her to hand him the presidency with her vote if it came to that. But as far as I'm aware, there isn't any real risk at the moment that it would come to that, that the court would have to decide between the two of them. Anybody else have a more pessimistic outlook than that?
Technical answer, if it's been termed out and if Trump is termed out and that we have no idea who the winner is, technically we follow the line of succession and go where? I guess to Nancy Pelosi. And
Nancy Pelosi. Yeah, I remember reading that a couple months ago and thinking how much that would infuriate Trump.
Yeah.
I know it happened on Veep at the end of one of the seasons, and I can't.
There you go. They have crack researchers, political scientists working for that show. Molly, I have a follow-up quickly though for you. Then there's one question. The person disappeared, but I'm going to ask this question anyway.
Okay.
Molly, you noted that through this litigation, it could be claimed that Trump's trying to steal the election, but that's being ignored more or less. So it's being reported, but people aren't, up in arms about it. They're kind of not taking him all that seriously. As you put it, the fever is being broken. I'm wondering if that itself is significant. So, here we have a presidential campaign that's just, suing in every state where it seems to be losing at the moment. What are we to make of that? Is that a serious problem going forward? Again, not so much the fact that the campaign is suing in every state, but instead that, okay, that's just Trump. That's what he does. And so we're not that worried about it, so on and so forth. It makes me think of our little discussion of the problem of legitimation, right? This loss of faith in institutions. So I wonder if you just talk a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, like I said, I do find it encouraging that it does, the fact Trump can no longer just say, no, I won, and have people treat it like, it's a legitimate claim. Like, well, Trump says he won and Biden says he doesn't. I mean, I did see that, I think it was the Atlanta Journal-Constitution basically put that on their front page, but for the most part, I think people are just looking at the map and they know how this works. And he's been saying this for weeks anyway. So that does make me a little hopeful, but at the same time, I don't know what happens when, I think we're also eager to push this away, including, I think, most of the more serious Republicans. I don't think Mitch McConnell is fond of Donald Trump, and I think he probably would rather have to deal with Joe Biden in a lot of ways. I don't think really anybody is excited about having to continue to the White House staff or the people in Congress. I think they would be pleased to not have to deal with the chaos machine that is Trump anymore. But I don't know that it's good for anybody if once Trump is out of the picture, please God, the Republican Party gets to just go back to being one of our two major legitimate parties as though none of this ever happened, especially considering that the result of the increasingly overt embrace of illegitimate maintenance of power is that they have this majority on the Supreme Court, what looks like a permanent majority on the Supreme Court, and the influence that brings. I think that does lead to a long-term loss of confidence. I mean, I've lost a lot of confidence in the Supreme Court as a impartial body of the government, and I don't know what happens next, but I think the Republican Party not reckoning with that and doing something to convince people that it is more legitimate than it has been for the last 5 years is an alarming reality.
John, I think you raised your hand.
Well, just a question for Molly. I'm curious. I mean, what would the reckoning look like, do you think, Molly? I mean, let's say you're, head of the RNC. I mean, what should they be doing?
Well, right now they should be saying that's nonsense, count every vote. And some of them are. I think most of them are just sort of quietly waiting for this to blow over. But going forward, I'm not sure. It would be a lot easier, I think, if, like you said, there had been more of a blue wave. If they had a lot of loss to claw back from, then they would have a reason to say, we made a mistake, we got caught up in this. But that's not the way that the Republican Party works, or that its media outlets work. So I'm not sure. And I'm worried that the way forward instead is going to be that this election will turn into the new Benghazi, and it will just be this sort of byword for, well, we know that the Democrats' hold on power is illegitimate because of unspecified scandal. Yeah, I don't know. I'm glad I'm not trying to make a path forward for the Republican Party legitimately, because I don't know what that could look like at this point.
Let me, sorry, Ting, I'm going to have a couple more questions here. So this is a question from Lisa Rajak, maybe. And again, I apologize for any mispronunciation. It's a question about voter fraud. So Lisa, I'm going to unmute you now.
Hi, my question is just, what do you think about the reports of votes being thrown out or the ghost voters that were reported in several different states? You said an unspecified scandal, but I mean, this is one of them that are already out there. So what did you think about that?
I haven't seen any legitimate claims of voter fraud or votes being thrown out. I mean, I know there are a lot of things being thrown around by the Trump campaign, but I haven't seen anything that seems like it has serious weight behind it. Maybe somebody else has.
I certainly haven't. And speaking of a moment of lack of credible leadership, both in church and in society, to a certain degree, I will share with you, Lisa. You can online watch people do the work of counting the votes, and it's very much somewhat soothing to see that happening, as well as somewhat in a meditative state, that you can see them do the work, slowly but surely count every vote. Regarding the lawsuits, I think somebody commented on Twitter or on the media that they are press releases with legal fees at this point. I mean, to a certain degree, as Molly was mentioning, they're not legitimate. I think for Georgia was over 53 votes that they wanted to stop counting. I think that's, if that was not the state, it was another one. And obviously they, that's not gonna stand.
I just remembered on the last question, talking about what can the Republican Party do, or what could they do? They went into the convention this year with no platform, literally no platform, except our party supports Trump in whatever he wants to do. So I guess that's the first step that they could take, is spend, assuming that there's a Biden presidency, that they can spend the next 4 years developing a platform, a real one that isn't just whatever Trump says is true. And I suppose that's a real opportunity.
I have a follow-up then for John there. So John, you noted that the Republican challenge is to dispense with Trump, but to keep Trump's Democrats, more or less. What does that look like? So let's say that you are now the chair of the RNC, and you're following Mollie's advice and developing, let's say, a platform. Now, I know people don't always vote for platforms, right? So social identities might matter a lot more. But in any event, how does the RNC develop, or how does the Republican Party develop in such a way to keep Trump's Democrats, if that's possible?
Yeah, right. Well, this is partly why I asked Molly the question. I'm not, I mean, it's a tough one, right? I mean, I'm not sure what that reckoning looks like. On the one hand, I think it can't, it's hard. I mean, I get the sense from Molly that, and maybe from others too, that what's sort of needed here is a kind of repudiation of Trump, right? That's full-throated and unequivocal, and um, I think that's hard if you're in a party where suddenly you're full of folks who would really adore Trump. I mean, one of the most striking things about the places we visited, and many places that fit this profile, is I mean, unlike the Clinton Democrats, and if you talk to like Clinton Democrats in Orange County, I mean, they basically, for them, it was sort of an anti-Trump vote, right? There was sort of Hillary was the better of two evils. But for a lot of the Trump Democrats, they were more excited about Trump than they had been about any candidate in decades. And so you had, voters trying to change their party registration just briefly in the primaries so they could vote for Trump, and you had local offices being overwhelmed. So the party really on the ground is really dealing with these sorts of voters, right? Voters who really have a sort of sense of kinship and deep loyalty and love for Donald Trump. And so that's the challenge, right? So somehow the party has to pivot away, has to somehow keep those voters, but pivot away from Trump. And I think, obviously, that means, of course, I think as Molly suggested, writing some sort of platform, but then what goes in it, and I think what goes in it has to, has to look probably a little different than the platforms of old. There has to be some kind of sort of take from Trump, some positive things. It might be a kind of economic nationalism, which you even hear creeping into Biden's rhetoric, right? I think Biden is really going to reshape the way parties are sort of talking about policies moving forward. And I think you see this in Biden again. You're talking about America, buying America, things made in America, and that kind of stuff. I think that's very much the legacy of Trump. So anyway, that's a kind of a non-answer, Bernard.
So we're at 1 full hour, and we should be bringing things to a close. There are a couple more questions in the chat, and I apologize to people, but I want to give the panelists just one last opportunity if you want to make another observation, a round of observations, so on and so forth. Somebody's got to tie this with the bow quite neatly. So who wants to rise to the challenge? Maybe we can have multiple attempts.
Yeah, I'll let Beth do that, but I'll just get onto this point, or Milton. I think we're forgetting also that politicians are responsive to the electorate, right? And they'll try to win by tapping into the views of the electorate, and that's what Trump did, right? I think what he did is he revealed a lot of a particular set of viewpoints from the electorate that were ignored or were thought was unacceptable for a lot of establishment Republicans, right? The McCains and the Romneys of the world, right? And he's tapped into that, and he's also transformed, right, and enlivened that in the electorate. And we can't forget the role of media too, right? Certain media sources, right, continue to influence and shape public opinion in a certain kind of way. If you're thinking about long-term change from the Republican Party, well, we have to think about how the Republican Party is able to transform perhaps the mindsets of the electorate, so that candidates who are Trumpians again, right, won't be reelected because of what the electorate's views are. And to be honest, I have no idea how they're going to be able to do that. You pay Rupert Murdoch to change Fox News in a certain kind of way? I'm not sure, right? They're going to continue to do business, because people are watching them. So
my only concluding thought, maybe two. For one, the vote's not over till the election's not over till all the votes are counted, and so we can speak about, right, the anyway, about the post-Trump presidency, but we don't know yet for sure. And second, I'm not as confident that the Republican Party thinks it needs to or really should consider retooling itself. They've done quite well, and maybe with a, I don't know, one of the Trump children, right? Maybe they might see a route forward as not that much different, maybe slightly less chaotic, but not that much different than what we've seen. So I think it's too early to make calls on either the results of the election or what we're going to see with the Republican Party going down the road in the long term.
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, this is a point that my colleague Steve Tellis has made, and but it's possible that both parties become more internally divided. We're sort of at this weird moment in American political history where there's so much coherence and within solidarity within the parties, but that's sort of an historical outlier. And if you look at the broad sweep of American history, there's been many more factional and internal tensions in American political parties. So it's possible that, on the Republican side, you get a sort of Trumpian wing of the party and a sort of more older kind of establishment wing. And then the Democrats too, I think it's possible, especially if Biden does lose, right, that you get a sort of resurgent, more democratic socialist wing that draws certain, different lessons from this election and says to be competitive, we need a Bernie Sanders style kind of candidate. And that deepens a kind of tension between kind of more, center-left progressives like Biden and a more sort of vocal AOC style kind of left-wing Democratic Party.
As we're closing, I find myself thinking about the pandemic again. I was struck during the whole campaign by the way the questions around that kept getting set up as either you want to get the economy going again or you want to pay attention to the virus, which always seemed to me to be a really ridiculous binary, because you can't fix the economy if people are still dying in record numbers and overwhelming hospitals and travel is still impossible and all of that. You can try to ignore it, but the economy doesn't restart until we contain the virus. So my hope is that if, with Trump's ego sidelined as a main consideration, that maybe we can at least hope for a real economic stimulus package, for the government to take seriously the possibility of paying people to stay home, in places where the virus is surging again, because that is now when all the dust settles, we're going to realize, we are still in the midst of this out of control disease spread. And are there things that can be done now that we no longer have, now that the Republican Party no longer has the mandate of having to pretend that actually, no, everything is going fine and it's just the Democrats that are keeping people from going back to their lives?
And maybe if I could just add, over the summer, Commonweal produced a two-part series, a podcast series on El Paso, looking 1 year after the one of the largest anti-Latino shooting attacks in American history, and one of the top 10 shooting massacres in the U.S. And to sort of add to what Mollie just mentioned, there are over 500 children that we know of that are still separated from their parents. And there could be plenty more. That number is just the one that is being reported. And so I also wonder, once the dust settles, all the damage that has been done to communities and to families and to children, particularly those who were already fleeing violence and persecution, that they also need to be, there's a sense of restorative justice that needs to take place there. And so I'm also thinking of them during this moment and the months to come.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a serious, substantial, and sobering discussion. I appreciate all your insights and your time. thank you to all our listeners as well for joining us and for your good questions. Thanks a lot. No new news came during our hour plus, so time still will tell. Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good afternoon.